First of all, thank you very much, Amberine, and a very warm welcome to you all for coming this evening, despite the weather. I have the pleasure and the privilege to introduce this evening a dear fellow agriculture economist with an international reputation that spans several decades. Alan Matthews is a professor emeritus of European agriculture policy at Trinity College, Dublin. His research interests include agricultural and trade policies and trade and economic development issues. Over the years, Alan has significantly contributed to various public policies. He has been a member of 3 World Trade Organization dispute settlements and arbitration panels, and he is a former member of Ireland Climate Change Advisory Council. He has contributed research to international organizations such as, you didn't say that in your, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the European Commission, and the European Parliament. He is a former president of the European Association of Agricultural Economists, and in 2014, Alan has been presented with an award for excellence by the Agriculture Economic Society for his outstanding contribution to public policy. Last but not least, Alan is a frequent blogger. He created the blog capreform.eu on issues relating to the EU CAP. So for any of you who is interested in finding out more about what's going on at the European level, look at Alan's blog. This evening, his talk will focus on trade policy and environmental sustainability within the EU context. Alan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Carmen, for that overly generous introduction. And thank you to the organizers and to the Centre for Rural Economy for the invitation to be part of your 30th anniversary celebrations. I guess it's conventional for a speaker to say thanks for an invitation. But in my case, it actually has quite a special meaning coming back to Newcastle. And if I may just take a couple of minutes to tell a personal story. I graduated in economics from the university where I spent most of my professional life, Trinity College in Dublin, in 1970, and I was lucky enough at the time to obtain what was then, I think it was a Nuffield Fellowship from the Overseas Development Institute. It was a scheme whereby they sort of posted young graduates to a ministry in a developing country, mainly in Africa, the Caribbean, and you had the opportunity to gain some experience of development issues. So I found myself working in Zambia in the Ministry of Rural Development for 2 years. When I returned to Ireland, Ireland, along with the UK at the time, it was 1972, we were just on the brink of joining what was then the European Economic Community. And from the agricultural point of view, this was a time of huge optimism. Of course, we in Ireland had for a long time suffered, if you like, under the UK cheap food policy. You were our major export market, so the returns that we got for our major exports of beef and butter at the time were relatively low. So the prospect of being able to enter inside what was a highly protected Fortress Europe market at the time was extremely attractive to our farmers and indeed to the country as a whole. So our National Farmers Organisation was recruiting additional staff. They needed to staff up an office in Brussels and so on, and I got an opportunity to work with them for 2 years. But then I thought, look, I'd really like to explore agricultural economics in a little bit more detail because I had just a general economics degree. So I saw that there was an opportunity for a Kellogg Fellowship, and it was administered through Newcastle University. And I remember traveling over for the interview. here. I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly which building it would have been then, 1975, Chris, you might remember. But I was interviewed, and this is names, I guess, for some of the older heads in the audience this evening. I was interviewed by Professor John Ashton and by Martin Whitby. And I don't remember much about the interview. But I do remember that I had done a little bit of research, as one does, and I had decided, yes, I wanted to everybody was speaking at the time about Iowa State University in the United States. Earl Heddy was the big guru in terms of agricultural economics. So I said I wanted to go to Iowa if I were awarded this fellowship. But John Ashton said to me, no, you don't want to go to Iowa, you want to go to Cornell. To be honest, I hadn't really heard much about Cornell. But I was awarded the fellowship. I'm not quite sure how I managed to persuade the two gentlemen. And I had a fantastic year. It was a condition of the fellowship at the time that you could only spend a year abroad and you had to return after a year. I would have been very keen to have stayed on, but that was the condition. And I suppose a number of kind of lessons that I just draw from that experience. I mean, one is the fact that it's amazing still that those of us in the former colony, if you like, of Ireland, that we still can benefit somewhat from some of the schemes in the UK. So I was an Irish national, yet able to go to Zambia and later to Cornell on schemes run out of the UK at the time. That internationalization, I hope, is not going to disappear in the current circumstances. The second point is, of course, the importance of the availability of fellowships and scholarships for people to attend higher education, to take further degrees. I really appreciate that, and of course, it set me on the career that Carmen has so generously described. But as I say, coming back today, despite the rain, coming back to Newcastle reminded me of that very first visit to the city, which was really so crucial in terms of setting me off on my own professional and personal career. So that's the biographical part. So let me now turn to what I want to discuss with you for the next 35 minutes or so, which is trade policy and environmental sustainability. And I'm going to both do the screen and because rather than just keep my back to you all the time, I'll keep the computer going at the same time. So I'm very well aware as an outside observer that there's been a very intense debate, particularly since Brexit, about the role of food standards in trade. And this, I guess, has been mainly stimulated by the enthusiasm of the British government to sign up to free trade agreements with countries as a sort of replacement for the single market access to the European Union. And in that enthusiasm, there were a lot of people who were concerned that this could lead to a lowering of food standards. So particularly if talks had got underway with the United States, there was talk of chlorinated chicken becoming available, hormone-treated beef, and so on. As I understand it, the current government's manifesto stated that there would be no regression in terms of UK food standards as a result of Brexit or as a result of free trade agreements. But when it came to actually inserting a firm legal commitment to this, there was an amendment to the Agriculture Bill at the time in 2020 from the House of Lords, which would have done this. But the government majority voted that down. But there was a huge backlash, as I understand it, led by the National Farmers Union here. They obtained over 1 million signatures. Lots of celebrity chefs like Jamie Oliver and so on joined in to insist that freer trade and trade agreements should not be at the expense of competition with UK farmers on the basis of lower standards. And the government, to some extent, relented and established, as I understand, this Trade and Agriculture Commission, which was set up to give, if you like, authoritative evidence-based advice on the implications of future trade deals for food standards in particular. You've since had the conclusion of the UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement, where there was some dissatisfaction with the ability of Parliament to really understand before the agreement was signed what the implications might be. And I saw even just last week the chair of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee writing to the Minister expressing dissatisfaction with the government response to their comments on that free trade agreement. What I think I find interesting is that much of that official debate, so in other words at the high political level, has revolved specifically around the role of food standards in trade agreements. Now there is a broader movement, as I understand, within the UK. For example, work being done by the World Wildlife Federation on core environmental standards, by some other campaigning groups, which wants to see standards for imports raised for all imports, and not just in the context of negotiating free trade agreements. But that seems to be the history, if you like, of this, the recent history of this debate in the United Kingdom. I now come to the EU side, and here the issue has become more prominent as a result of the incoming European Commission's vision for Europe contained in the European Green Deal. So if you recall, this was a response to the outcome of the European elections in May of 2019, where the traditional dominant groupings, the European People's Party on the centre-right and the Social Democrats on the centre-left, that majority was lost. You had the entry of a much larger Green grouping with support from a lot of younger voters, and also the Renew Europe grouping, which also saw itself as pro-environment. So the European Green Deal, I guess, is familiar to everybody here. It sets out this ambition for Europe to become a climate neutral economy by 2050, increases the intermediate reduction targets for 2030, and specifically in the case of food and farming, it sets ambitious targets for the reduction in the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, antimicrobials, increase in the area under organic farming, and also setting aside significantly more land for nature. So all of this is designed to try to help farming and the food system more generally to make this transition to a more sustainable and healthy food system. And it was quite clear in the documents, both for the Green Deal and for the so-called Farm to Fork strategy, that all EU policies, including trade policy, were expected to support these Green Deal ambitions. And also, as part of a treaty obligation in the European Union, indeed, there is an obligation to ensure policy coherence for sustainable development. That is to say that there is an obligation to look at the impact of all policies and policy changes, particularly on the more vulnerable developing countries, the global south. So that's the context in which the debate in terms of trade and food standards in the European Union has evolved. And what I would like to say, there we are. What I would like to say is that there's been really a massive follow-up by the Commission in terms of policy and legislative initiatives since that announcement of the Green Deal in December of 2019. And I've just listed some of them here. I would just say that if you look at the basic documents announcing the Green Deal and subsequently the Farm to Fork strategy, both of them contain significant elements on the external dimension of these Green Deal policies. So in February of 2021, we had a review of EU trade policy. It had a number of pillars, it suggested the EU should become more assertive, not be so naive perhaps in terms of its outward-looking trade policies, but also a strong emphasis that there should be secure and sustainable supply chains. And as part of that, that imports should be expected to satisfy the standards that would also apply to EU farmers. The issue again arose in the political negotiations around the most recent CAP reform. The Commission made its proposal in 2018. It was finally the political agreement in July of 2021. The Parliament, interestingly coming from the Environment Committee rather than the Agriculture Committee in the Parliament, proposed an amendment essentially very similar to the House of Lords amendment in the UK, although that applied only to, as I say, to trade agreements, whereas the European Parliament's amendment would have made all imports subject to meeting standards that also apply to European farmers. Now, that amendment was not adopted, but instead there was an agreement that, well, there were a number of sort of agreements attached to that political agreement on the CAP reform, and one of them was that the Commission would bring forward a report looking at the feasibility, both in terms of legal requirements with WTO and so on, but also operational issues around the possibility of requiring imports to meet these domestic standards. We've had a proposed regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. We've had a proposal to adopt a so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism on a range of industrial products. We've had the introduction of a so-called mirror clause, which is precisely this reciprocity that imports should meet the same standards as European farmers with respect to the use of antibiotics in animal husbandry. I'll come back and talk about that in a moment. There's a proposal for a corporate sustainability due diligence directive. There's been a review of the trade and sustainable development chapters in the EU's free trade agreements. There's been announced there's to be a review of animal welfare legislation, and as part of that, the Commission will again look at the feasibility of requiring imports to meet certain animal welfare requirements that are already required for European farmers. And then the sort of big one is the proposal for a regulation on sustainable food systems framework, which is due by the end of next year, and which will set out general principles to ensure sustainability of food that is supplied on the EU market, both domestically and from imports. So the objectives of these measures are, of course, to secure or safeguard EU production capacity by ensuring that EU producers compete with imports on a level playing field, very similar arguments made in the UK. And I suppose linked to that, the sort of political economy issue to limit opposition to raising domestic sustainability standards in the future, and to head off the call for lower standards from an important producer group. And another important objective is to avoid offshoring the negative environmental consequences of EU consumption through existing or increased imports. So, for example, in the context of climate change policy, if we impose regulations on European farmers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they increase costs for farmers, there is the risk that production falls in the European Union. And of course, if we don't have any corresponding change in consumption, that will then be met by increased imports, increased production in third countries, potentially with even larger emission intensities. And you know, at least in principle, you might end up increasing overall global emissions, even though we are reducing them within Europe. And finally, particularly for the European Union, probably less an argument in the United Kingdom, is the idea that we can use access to our very large market as a way of trying to leverage higher sustainability standards in those countries that export to us. So what underlies, I think, or what makes this debate around trade policy and sustainability particularly interesting and maybe a little bit different to other trade policy debates. Of course, under WTO rules, there's no question that countries have the right to protect themselves against imports that are a threat to plant or animal or human health, provided that they follow certain procedures set out in the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Standards Agreement under the WTO. But when we're talking about sustainability standards, we're referring to a much broader range of issues covering climate, environmental requirements, social impacts, and animal welfare impacts. And what's important about these is that they relate to the way that a product is produced, the practices used in producing the product, not necessarily related to the product itself. So in other words, these characteristics don't necessarily show up in the product. If you look at an apple, it's very hard to tell, is that an organic apple or is that an apple produced under conventional production practices? And that is a much more complex issue in terms of regulation under WTO rules. It also often requires third-party certification. Again, think of the way in which organic products require to be certified in the exporting country. The EU, or the UK also, I think you've taken over that legislation, would then, if you like, recognize certificates issued by that organic certifying body in the exporting country, Chile, United States, wherever, as equivalent to a certificate issued within the domestic market. But it's not just certification, it may well be that separate supply chains have to be established. If you again take the example of hormone-treated beef, that requires a separate supply chain to be established to ensure that indeed beef supplied has not been treated with hormones. So of course, there are these additional costs involved in administering these kind of import standards. And I suppose also, if you look at the debate more globally, there is a concern that there is a sort of extraterritorial dimension to these standards. So in the case of the EU, we are requiring countries to follow the rules that we have set. Now, you can argue that it's completely voluntary for them. It's only if they want to export to the EU that they are required to follow these. We're not insisting that they do it for exports or indeed for their domestic market. But there is that sense that we are trying to impose standards on third countries, which does create a backlash in some cases. Now, I've talked a little bit, or mentioned a little bit, the WTO considerations. I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not going to go into the WTO aspects of trade and sustainability standards, simply to draw the conclusion that I take from the literature here, that there are various requirements, if you like, that would have to be met in order for a trade and import standard to be consistent with a country's obligations under the WTO. The most important one is non-discrimination. You certainly can't impose a standard on imports that you haven't also imposed on your own producers. That kind of goes without saying. But there are other ways in which you can try to justify standards. The Article 20 of the GATT, which deals with general exceptions, including exceptions for the purposes of conserving natural resources and the environment. So basically, my conclusion is that it's not impossible to justify import standards, but they have to be carefully crafted and very carefully targeted on the environmental objective. They shouldn't be a disguised form of protectionism, for example. They should be proportionate. In other words, you should be able to show that you can't really achieve that environmental objective, through other less trade restrictive measures. But having said that, there are possibilities under the WTO to introduce some of these measures. Is the conclusion that I draw. Okay, it tells me here my battery is running low, so Umbereen, we'll see how far I can get on this. So what I want to do for the rest of the talk is I want to just tell you a little bit more about some of those EU policy initiatives. There may be some lessons here that may be of interest to the debate within the United Kingdom. And then I want to sort of just raise some more general issues from a kind of an economics perspective as to how we might want to evaluate and maybe challenge some of the assumptions behind these initiatives. So I'm going to divide them into sort of multilateral, bilateral, and unilateral measures. So, for example, the multilateral agreements. So what we're talking about here are using international bodies. I give the example of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which sets food safety standards. Using those international bodies to set and to raise sustainability standards. So, for example, within the World Organization for Animal Health, there are standards which have been adopted on, for example, animal welfare, also on the use of antimicrobials for animal husbandry. Also, you can negotiate completely new agreements around a specific environmental issue. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change, of course, being one, but another relevant example is the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. And indeed, the EU is pushing that, particularly within the Codex, which, as I say, deals generally with food safety standards, pesticide maximum residue limits, and so on, that it could also push for introducing sustainability standards. I have to say there isn't much enthusiasm for that at the moment, but it's obviously early days. Now, an international agreement that sets high minimum standards and also has a credible enforcement mechanism is absolutely the gold standard, because it addresses all of those objectives that I mentioned earlier. It establishes a level playing field. It avoids that if EU consumers choose imported products, that they are contributing to an additional environmental burden, because all countries essentially are meeting the same standards. The problem is that it's very rare to get an international agreement that actually achieves both high environmental standards. It's usually a lowest common denominator approach. And again, the Paris Agreement is probably a good example, where the agreement simply allows countries to decide on their own level of ambition in terms of emissions reduction. And very often where standards are achieved, for example, the animal welfare standards in the World Organization for Animal Health, they are not necessarily enforced in domestic legislation, or if they are included in domestic legislation, they may not be actually enforced. So there's a frustration at the slow pace of using the multilateral route to raise international sustainability standards, and hence this motivation for more bilateral and particularly unilateral action. And that's what we're going to focus on, the measures, the unilateral measures. But I would want to emphasize that this sort of what I call here international Green Deal diplomacy remains hugely important, because one of the objectives of unilateral measures is, of course, to try to bring other countries with us. And therefore, we do need to keep talking with them and to use opportunities within the WTO, within these existing international bodies and agreements, to try to make the case that globally we need to see these standards raised. Another area that's been very dynamic recently in the European Union has been the revision, the revamping of these trade and sustainable development chapters. They've been a part of EU and there's also UK trade agreements since around 2011, but they generally have been seen as relatively weak. First of all, their coverage wasn't very extensive. Secondly, they tended to have no real enforcement mechanisms. They tended to be excluded from the sort of dispute mechanism provisions of these agreements. And the sort of role of civil society organizations was seen as insufficient. The momentum for change here within the EU came about during the negotiations on the EU-Canada, the CETA free trade agreement, where civil society really organized around this issue. The Commission responded by sort of setting out an agenda of around 15 actions that they would introduce to try to kind of make this chapter more actionable. And again, in the light of that 2021 trade policy white paper that I mentioned, the Commission launched a public consultation and has subsequently issued a communication on trade partnerships, where it has really been much more specific about what it wants to see in its own free trade agreements in the future. And in particular, not only does it want to see a much broader coverage of issues, for example, on climate change, it will require not only that its trading partner accepts the ambitions of the Paris Agreement, but for the more developed countries, obviously New Zealand, Australia, are the current free trade area negotiations ongoing in the European Union. It wants them to actually sign up to a net zero commitment as part of the free trade agreement. And importantly, that this would in fact be actionable. In other words, that it would be subject to sanctions, to a dispute settlement mechanism with sanctions, in other words, the withdrawal of preferences, if it turned out that the country was not living up to that commitment. So this is a really significant step forward to making this chapter much more ambitious in the future. Of course, it's an interesting trade-off in terms of those 3 or 4 objectives that I outlined at the very beginning, because free trade agreements are essentially bargains between the two parties. And if the EU puts more demands on the table, it says we not only want market access for product A, B, and C, but we also want you to sign up to more ambitious sustainability demands, then of course that country is likely to come back and say, well, okay, we were prepared to do that, but in return, we want not just only increased access for products A, B, and C, but we also want D and D, as a bargaining trade-off. So what you might see emerging is, yes, we have higher standards in the exporting country, but we also potentially have greater market competition for our own producers, given that we have, in a sense, sold a greater market access in return for that. Let me move to the just want to make sure I'm staying on my time. The mandatory import standards, which in Europe are sometimes referred to as these mirror clauses. And we can take the ban on imports of hormone-treated beef as a sort of an early example of a mirror clause, because it related, okay, there was a health dimension to it. There was fear in the European Union that these hormones could interfere with reproductive and functions and so on. But it was really a concern with the way the beef was produced that was important. A more recent example is the restriction on import of meat treated with antibiotics, which is actually now European law under the Veterinary Medicinal Products Regulation. And here there are 2 requirements. First of all, the EU has said that it is not any longer willing to import meat where antibiotics have been used for growth promotion purposes. Okay, it's been banned in the European Union for many years. In fact, even in the European Union, we don't permit the use of antibiotics for purely preventative, if you like, purposes, only for therapeutic uses. But that's a significant change in policy. And also, there is a list of antibiotics that the EU considers are vital to protect for human use. So they say we simply don't want these to be used in animal husbandry at all. So if you are using these in your animal production, again, we will not allow the import of meat from that. We don't know yet what the impact of that is, because actually, although it's written into the legislation, which has been enforced since January of this year, the relevant delegated acts setting out the list of these antibiotics and how the EU intends to control whether antibiotics have been used for growth promotion purposes, those delegated acts haven't yet been published. So it's still something which is in process. Another example in terms of the European Union debate concerns what's known as maximum residue limits for pesticides. And there are two issues here where the Commission has promised to take action. One is to review import tolerances for active substances which are banned in the EU because of the hazard-based criteria in the pesticides regulation. So let me just explain what that means. So essentially, for an active substance, let's say glyphosate, to be approved within the European Union, it has to have a risk assessment, which is undertaken by the European Food Safety Authority. And it is assessed for risks both to human and plant health, but also for risks to the environment. So if the active substance does not pass that risk assessment on both of those dimensions, it's not approved for use in the European Union. And in the most recent revision of the pesticides regulation, it was deemed that substances that are defined as mutagenic or carcinogenic or toxic or dangerous for reproduction would simply be banned regardless of any. You didn't have to take a risk assessment, okay? They would simply be deemed, there was a so-called cut-off criteria, and they would simply not be permitted on the EU market. Now, what's important here is that there are many pesticides which are not approved for use in the EU, and yet we permit imports that use these pesticides in the exporting country. And this is because if the reason for non-approval in the EU is not on health grounds, if it's on health grounds, then you're also banned in terms of imports. But if you are banned on environmental grounds, that is not a consideration that is taken into account when setting these maximum residue limits. So maximum residue limits are permitted, as I say, provided there's no health risk to consumers, but they may be banned in the EU for environmental reasons, or they may be, they may simply not, the manufacturer may simply not have submitted a request for authorization. Maybe the crop is not sufficiently important in the EU, or there isn't sufficient data in terms of trials and so on to make a case. A good example here are the neonicotinoids, where the EU has banned the outdoor use of 3 neonicotinoids. These are one of the most common insecticides used globally. And even though they are banned generally for European farmers, they can be used under emergency authorization. But we don't have a sort of zero or close to zero limit on the maximum residue limit for imported products. So it's still possible for exporting countries to use these pesticides, even though European farmers don't use them. So what the Commission has said, well, we are going to actually, in future, take into account the environmental risks, not only in Europe, because that's done in the approval process, but for setting these maximum residue limits on imports, we're going to take into account the environmental impact in the exporting country. Okay, so we're going to evaluate whether there is a threat to bees, which is the main reason why the neonicotinoids are banned in the European Union, if there's a threat to bees and pollinators generally in the exporting country. So that would then become an import standard that the exporting country would have to meet. Due diligence is another way of imposing import standards. And the best example here is the proposal for due diligence on forest risk commodities. So we know that EU consumption through imports contributes to tropical deforestation, particularly in terms of beef, soya, but also cocoa, coffee. So the proposal is not that we will have a formal import standard. The proposal is that operators, that is to say companies importing these products, will have to demonstrate that they have undertaken sufficient due diligence to ensure that the products they import have not been produced on land which has been recently deforested. Okay, and when I say recently, so in the last two years and from now on, so there's a kind of cut-off date. And the companies will do this. They will, so for every shipment, they will be required to provide a certificate showing the geographical location of where that particular cocoa bean or that soya bean was actually grown. So the intention of the Commission is that satellite data will be used for this purpose. But in principle, every trader, operator using cocoa or coffee should be able to show, look, I have a certificate showing that that particular coffee that I have purchased was not grown on land that has been recently deforested. So that's currently going through the trilogue process in Brussels. It's not yet law. And of course, one of the big issues is just how feasible will this be. I can see how for fixed tree crops, it may well be feasible. And indeed, those involved in the cocoa chain are working very closely with the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And it does seem as if they will be able to provide this level of certification. But for example, if you take the issue of deforestation in Brazil caused by imported beef, the meat processors in Brazil, they know and they can confirm that where the farms that they purchase the finished beef cattle from, they know where those farms are. They can guarantee that those farms are not in deforested areas. But the problem is that those farms are actually importing feeder cattle from other farms that may well have been established in areas that are recently deforested. And without a full traceability system, such as we have in the European Union, it's impossible for the processor to actually prove one way or the other. And I don't think satellite data is necessarily going to resolve that issue. So I'm going to be curious to see how that's going to apply in the case of beef. There's not just the forest risk commodities, there's a general obligation in this new proposed sustainability due diligence directive for companies, larger companies generally in this case, to be aware of potential risk issues in their supply chain. Not only environmental issues, but also things like forced labor, child labor, and other similar types of issues. And in particular, in the case of climate, for example, there will be a requirement to assess whether your operations are at climate risk, and if so, you will be required to have a climate action plan setting out reduction commitments and so on. And what's important is the way in which that will be enforced, partly through linking the success in achieving those commitments to the remuneration of your directors, which I guess is a good idea. But probably more important is the fact that it will become actionable through civil liability suits. So if in fact an NGO wants to take a case against a particular company, it will have some rights under this directive. Carmen, I see. How am I doing in terms of time? A little.
Probably. Can you need 2 minutes more?
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Sorry, I got lost in my clock there. Let me just mention the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because sometimes that's also raised in the UK debate. In the European Union, it's raised very much in the context of the emissions trading scheme, where there is a concern that some of the industries covered by the emissions trading scheme could be at risk of relocating out of the European Union if the cost of these emissions becomes too high. So very energy intensive companies, for example, fertilizer production would be a good case. So what the European Union has done until now, it has been to give these companies free allowances. So they don't have to pay for all of the allowances that they need to cover their emissions. They get, in the case of the fertilizer industry, for example, they get more than three quarters of them actually allocated for free. So which obviously diminishes their incentive to actually take the necessary steps to reduce their emissions. So what the carbon border adjustment mechanism is to say is that we want to phase out these free allowances, and instead we will impose an equivalent levy on imports of products. And for the initial legislation, they've just chosen 5 products that are characterized by very short supply chains. So they're kind of very pure commodities, so easy in a sense to try to calculate what the emissions embedded in those imports are going to be. So when we come to actually ask, could this be extended to food? The short answer is no, because food, of course, is not part of the emissions trading scheme. There's no sort of carbon tax applied throughout Europe on food. So there's no basis for establishing such a levy on imported food. But it could be that over the next decade that there could be some attempt to include agriculture in an emissions trading scheme, or to apply a sort of a carbon tax, in which case it could, at least in principle, become an issue. But of course, food and the supply chain of food is much more complex than for iron or for fertilizer. So the practical issues would be much more dramatic. And I'm running out of time, but maybe just to throw up some questions which we could take for discussion. So it seems to me that I've tried to illustrate, there's really a lot of dynamism in this area, at least in the European Union. So what are the issues that we might want to discuss? First of all, is this level playing field argument justified? Yes, it can raise costs for European producers, but sometimes those costs can be recovered from the marketplace. You can get a premium price. European products are more highly valued because consumers appreciate that they are produced to higher standards. And even though standards are high in the European Union and have been increasing, we actually don't see a competitive loss. In fact, if anything, the European Union has become its net export position has increased over the last decade. But nonetheless, I think there is clearly a risk that if we continue to raise standards even higher, that ultimately there does come a point where your costs are increased to an extent that you do begin to lose competitiveness. The other argument, of course, in the European Union is that farmers already get very considerable support, partly in recognition of the fact that they are facing these higher standards. So the cross-compliance under the direct payments, for example, is partly justified by the size of those payments. So if you're a third country and you're being told that you have to meet standards that European Union producers are meeting, you can maybe turn around and sort of say, well, yes, but European Union will get a lot of support to meet those standards. What's going to happen to us? There's an issue of what standards should be part of these core environmental standards. And here, the European Union is very definite that it is looking at what are called global environmental goods. So in other words, if you are trying to insist that your exporting partner should change its production practices because of the potential damage to bees and pollinators, that the argument there is that that is an issue of global concern. So we in Europe are concerned by what is happening in the United States or in Brazil. And I think it's relatively easy to make that argument for, on climate issues, on biodiversity, on marine pollution, for example. Maybe more difficult on some issues like water quality, air quality, ammonia emissions, and so on. So we need to think carefully about what standards we might want to require. How effective will import standards be in practice? One of the issues here, again, maybe somewhat different in the UK, is that, of course, by definition, they only apply to imports. But if you are a significant exporter of a product, of course, then these standards don't help you. You have your higher costs, but you have to compete on the world market without support. Also, there's an issue of whether what we're doing is simply cleaning up EU supply chains. So maybe the exporting country says, okay, we're going to send our best quality produce to the EU, but we're going to continue to export poor animal welfare products to China or to countries that are less concerned about these standards. So there's issues around effectiveness, and in particular then addressing the concerns of developing countries. So I'm going to hop over. I have various things literally just to my summary. So in my view, it's clear we do need to raise sustainability standards globally. It's not the loss of biodiversity. Greenhouse gas emissions are not just European or UK problems, they're global problems. Antibiotic resistance is again a global problem. We need to address these problems globally. Requiring imports to meet sustainability standards, it's obviously, for those of us interested in trade policy, it's a non-tariff measure. It will raise trade costs and reduce trade, but of course the benefit is a potential improvement in environmental outcomes. So we shouldn't automatically rule these measures out. But I would say choose your battles. A blanket requirement that all imports should meet domestic standards, it doesn't seem to me to make much sense. So decide, what are the real issues where we think import standards could make a difference, and concentrate on those. And choose the appropriate instrument, because you've seen in the European Union there's a range of instruments. So we have mirror clauses, but we also have due diligence requirements. We also have border levies as a possible instrument. Effective multilateral agreements indeed are the gold standard, but as I said, are very difficult to implement. Mirror clauses, probably the most trade restrictive of all of the ones we've looked at, the most likely to invite trade retaliation. One of the issues that I think we need to think about is that it's kind of one size fits all. If you have an import standard, all imports must meet it, including developing countries as well as more capable exporters. And in the case of climate, for example, where we've accepted that there's a principle of common but differentiated responsibility, we don't expect developing countries to make the same commitments as we do in the developed world. That can be problematic. And then I just raised the issue, which maybe we can discuss in the questions. Is this the time to be sort of inducing increased trade tensions by these unilateral measures, when clearly we do need a more cooperative world order? Thanks, Carmen.